the map of economic freedom in the world. I've noticed it being used numerous times to bypass talks about capitalism's faults, simply blaming it on economic restrictions instead. You may remember V using it and the same argument in his response to me. If you see somebody using this map, I highly advise you link them to this video, as there are just so many problems with using this as a defense of capitalism's injustices.
By defending, you mean pointing out where it's got a better record than socialism?
So somebody says that capitalism creates really, really bad situations, death and all that. But then somebody responds by saying, aha, and sending you the map. The map details countries in the world dependent upon economic freedom. In the green nations that are economically free, Hong Kong, Canada, Switzerland, New Zealand, there is plentiful wealth and relatively little systemic poverty or death. In the redder nations that are economically restricted, India, the Congo, Myanmar, or the Philippines, we see far more systemic poverty and death. Therefore, the conclusion goes that this is not the problem of capitalism, it is the problem of the lack of free markets. We must therefore get these redder nations more green, and our problems will be solved.
I'm not so sure I'd go as far as saying solved, but certainly their situation would be improved.
There's a lot of problems with this logic, and capitalism is not excused here. For starters, all that this map showcases is that countries with economic freedom tend to have less poverty. Not that economic freedom equals less devastation. This is only, after all, just one variable.
Well, fortunately, I made a map that's got per capita GDP in PPP dollars. It should be easy enough to understand. Liechtenstein, at full green, is the wealthiest, and the Central African Republic, at full red, is the poorest.
Unfortunately for us, the world does not work on an on-off switch in regards to economic systems. Serbia and Uganda are literally 0.3 points away from one another in this study, yet one is considered moderately free, whilst the other mostly unfree.
Seriously? You're misstating what they're arguing and then arguing against that? That's low. They created an index ranking each country individually and put it in a table, which I know you saw since you just put it in your video. And you're bitching about them breaking a continuum into verbally labeled sections? We draw arbitrary lines and continuums, or continua, all the time. Blood alcohol content for safe driving, how tall you must be to ride a ride, all the different bands of the electromagnetic spectrum.
Their nominal GDP is ridiculously sparse, as it goes for many other countries close to one another. There's a very pernicious and problematic line of thought that permeates our culture. We'll call it linear thinking. When we see a good example of something and a bad equivalent, it's very easy for us to assume we'll simply need to apply the good to the bad, then everything will be dandy. It is, and continues to be, a very prevalent mindset for all of us, and it's far too myopic.
When you see countries with identical cultures and climates, where one has a largely free economy and the other a largely socialist one, and the free economy is prosperous and the socialist one is a shithole, and this pattern holds among multiple pairs, Hong Kong and ROC compared to PRC, North and South Korea, East and West Germany, you have a strong case that the free market creates prosperity.
Because the truth of the matter is that we forget that many of these countries don't even have the ability to become economically freer. This is where it gets very messy. A cake is made up of 1 part meebles and 3 parts weebles. Meebles are very, very good for you, but weebles are highly toxic. This seems ridiculous. If we thought about this linearly, wouldn't the correct way to do this be to simply not use any weebles at all? No. The twist here is that meebles alone are completely inedible. And in order to even it out, you need to fill in 3/4 of the cake with the toxic but edible weebles. So in this scenario, whilst it might seem like the solution is very straightforward, the reality is both ingredients are necessary for achieving a desired result. Our economy works in a similar way.
How does this cake analogy make any sense? What do the meebles and weebles represent? What is the desired result? Who is doing the desiring? Are the free market economies full of people who can eat meebles and are immune to the poison of weebles? In a real economy, people would develop a cake that doesn't require meebles or weebles, but has flour, eggs, butter, sugar, baking powder, and some flavorings.
The way that they accomplish this? Debt. Debt is a primary tactic utilized by Western nations. The two horsemen of the capitalist apocalypse, the IMF and the World Bank, love to shove loans down the throats of LEDCs like thick dollops of ice cream. And they don't have much choice in the matter. Either accept the demands, or there will be consequences. And what are their demands? Ironically enough, free markets.
I don't think you understand what a free market is. State-created banks are not an element of a free market. In a free market, the banks would look at these countries, assess their abilities and likelihood of repaying the loans, and lend accordingly.
These places will never pay their loans back.
Which is to be expected from politically motivated loans by meddlesome do-gooders.
So there's a fault of logic at bay here. It assumes that these nations are poor simply because they are economically restricted, not detained because they didn't get the historical head start and thus succumbed to exploitation and imperialism by the ones who did. Are we going to say that countries like Switzerland or America are so great because of economic freedom or because of geographical placement?
This was addressed earlier when I pointed out the contrast between North and South Korea.
We got the head start. We were able to charge in first and place our bets.
This was addressed earlier when I pointed out the contrast between North and South Korea. So correlation does not equal causality here, but it does a few minutes ago?
Most of the founding fathers and subsequent presidents supported to varying degrees a form of protectionism as their nation was developing from an agrarian economy. In fact, in the 1880s, during its so-called Gilded Age, the country had an industrial tariff rate of 50%. 25% times its contemporary figure.
You need to understand that back then the United States had no income tax. Tariffs were the principal form of revenue for the federal government.
All economies require nurture. We don't just throw children into the wild and let them try and figure things out unguided and without help by...
We must pick up the white man's burden and teach these poor benighted primitives how to run their economies.
Fidel Castro once said in an interview that... But then where exactly does this map come from anyway? Heritage.
Whose badness was proven by the scary music.
I know every group has an agenda, but heritage is the last place I go for any objective opinion.
Says the guy who goes to Fidel Castro.
I was going to explain how heritage calculates the Economic Freedom Index, but we're running on here, and you can just look it up for yourself.
Not only can everyone do so, I would suggest that they actually do so. And this is where you show that you're not worth listening to. Economically unfree capitalism makes about as much sense as anarcho-capitalism, anarcho-communism for that matter, or skeptical feminism. Good day.